Auras have been massively changed. These are going to be significantly more powerful for the average build, while being substantially less powerful for aura bots. They've changed out a lot of the way that aura effectiveness works, and now aura effectiveness is more so of a personal stat. It only really works for you and your character, meaning aura stackers are good, but aura bots seem to be out. They've also changed some of the ways that reduced reservation works with mana versus life. The implications of this on low life builds are yet to be seen, but we're going to have to find out. And last but certainly not least, fire and cold elemental damage over time builds have seemingly got a massive facelift. Creeping Frost might be okay, Burning Arrow looks like it's a little bit simpler to play, and you can pretty much ignite with any build now? Let's talk about it. Hey guys, Big Ducks here, and welcome back to the channel. If you're new or part of the large percentage of people who are still not subscribed to this YouTube channel, make sure that you do that so that these videos will show right up in your feed, and make sure to like the video if you're enjoying all the content. Alrighty, so these changes are way shorter. Hopefully it'll be a much shorter video, but these are quite impactful for the people who care about auras. Auras, curses, and elemental damage over time. So there is not a ton to go over here, but I do want to do some of the specifics of the changes that are happening. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about is auras. The reduced reservation stat provided very little benefit at low values, but becomes very powerful when heavily invested in. This allows players to run every aura in the game, which yes, they could. It was pretty insane. It also forces reduced reservation to be balanced around extreme levels of investment, limiting how useful it can be to characters that do not run enormous numbers of reservation skills. And then finally, characters that heavily invested in reduced reservation in order to run more skills on mana were able to reserve life extremely effectively as well, with no further investment, rendering this the only sensible way to play most heavily reservation focused builds. There were issues where you would essentially just get as much energy shield as you possibly can, reserve all of your life, reserve all of your mana, and just be a walking monster, right? The solution is replace reservation reduction with reservation efficiency. When stacked, reservation efficiency does not allow for infinite auras. This can be given out much more liberally as a result, letting characters run additional reservation effects with only a couple sources of reservation efficiency. What this means is that a character who wants to take 1 or 2 reservation efficiency nodes and run a couple of auras for themselves is getting a massive buff to how powerful those auras can be and how many they can run, and characters who are trying to run like 10, 15, 20, however many auras they possibly can are no longer really going to be able to do that. So let's talk about the specifics. Modifiers to reservation have been replaced with reservation efficiency. It works by dividing the cost of the reservation effect. So 100% increased reservation efficiency would half the cost of all auras. 50% reservation efficiency cuts down costs enough to let you reserve an additional 50% aura. So essentially, once again, at the low end, you're going to be able to have way more auras without having to worry about investing so much to have them. Now, one big change is that the vast majority of reservation efficiency is now mana specific. There are some instances of non-mana specific ones, like there are a few items that still just do give general reduction, like general reservation efficiency, but it doesn't seem to be the case that all auras and all reservation efficiency is meant to work with life-based auras. The next issue here is that characters specialized in maximizing the power of auras provide an absolutely insane amount of damage and defense to party members. You might have heard problems of people like playing aura bots, right? That was the main complaint that a lot of people had, is that aura bots trivialized the entirety of the game. Someone could just go hire a random person to basically carry them through content by being an aura bot. Was kind of a problem for the people who had issues with that. The solution is remove sources of aura effect from cluster jewels and move the aura cluster jewel type to small cluster jewels. It's going to be much harder to get access to these because small cluster jewels are way harder to actually get effectiveness out of because they're 3 deep, and they're also, you have to take like nodes to be able to get the effects of them. So they're also introducing a new cluster jewel notable to increase the effect of your auras on you for builds that are building auras for their own power. So that is talking about aura stackers, like ones that stack all the auras on themselves so that they can do the damage, not so that other people can do the damage. So looking in the specifics here, there's not really much to go off of. You can look through here if auras do interest you. Nothing too special, it's just that they are changing the way that these numbers work. They're nerfing them for people who are trying to be aura bots and making them somewhat still effective if you're trying to be an aura stacker, meaning that you're doing the damage yourself. The next thing to talk about is curses. Characters specialized in maximizing the number and power of curses provided far too much damage and defense to party members. This was an issue as well, not as much as auras, but still a very big issue. Make the curse cluster jewels a small cluster jewel, same as the auras that they did before, meaning that they're going to be harder to invest into, and greatly improving a character's wanting to maximize their personal curse of choice. So what this means is that if you are a build that uses versus maybe one curse, now you can invest heavily into making that one single curse substantially better, or maybe two curses substantially better, instead of just having like ridiculous curse efficiency on everything. So if you look at some of the clusters here that are being changed, it's quite a large amount of these. You'll notice that there's like Evil Eye, Whispers, they've all been changed around a little bit. And it says, in general, curse effect that applies to all curses no longer exists on Cluster Jewel notable passives. So that is a pretty big nerf to curse effectiveness. The nodes that gave specific curses increased effect are now buffed up to 40%, which is pretty good if you want to grab those, like, say you have a Fizz-based large Cluster Jewel and you wanted to get that like vulnerability node on there, it's going to make vulnerability a lot more powerful than it did previously. Those nodes are going to be pretty good. They have also added new Curse Cluster Jewel notables that benefit Doom, Marks, and Hexes that previously didn't have their own notables, such as Punishment, Elemental Weakness, Temporal Chains, and Enfeeble. Now, interestingly, they say Marks. I'm wondering if there are going to be some interesting ones for Marks. Now, the next thing to talk about is Elemental Damage over time. The Elemental Damage over time effects of Cold Damage over time, Burning, and Ignite are too dependent on Elemental Overload and Elemental Equilibrium. This is true. Both of those felt necessary to make Cold Dot as well as Fire Dot builds. It felt necessary to make them work. Ignites are too dependent on Ignite damage multipliers on skills. This is very true. You might have noticed that most of the skills that end up being good for Ignite are ones that have multipliers built into the skills. Fireball, Burning Arrow, Armageddon Brand, things like that. Their solution to this is to greatly improve the base strength of Ignite, Burning, and Cold damage over time, while making Elemental Overload and Elemental Equilibrium less powerful or require more investment with damage over time skills. Rebalance the skills that could apply Ignite effects around the new base damage of Ignite and remove the Ignite damage multipliers. So what they're trying to do is make it so that Cold damage over time abilities are just good in general without having these extra nodes. And then on top of that, Ignite is now going to be viable for most different fire-based skills, instead of it just being locked behind these couple that had these Ignite multipliers. So as you can see, Player Ignite now inherently deals 150% more damage than before. So it's 125% of base damage over 4 seconds. That is pretty large. Cold damage over time skills also are now dealing more damage. So if you can see here, Creeping Frost, for example, we're going to use this one. Previously, it would go up to, let's see here, 1391.2 cold damage per second at level 20 of the gym. Now it is up to 2225. That is a absolutely massive buff. Almost 1,000, almost like 70% increase in damage. That's a pretty massive base damage buff. Hopefully this gives Cold Dot skills the boost in damage they need to be worthwhile again. Because I was kind of getting to the point where I felt like maybe Creeping Frost wouldn't even be worthwhile to choose as a build anymore. These changes might bring these skills back into the limelight. Here's hoping. I really liked Creeping Frost as a build. It was always a build that I liked suggesting to new players. I wasn't going to even have it on my list this league, but maybe it might be able to make a comeback. Oh yeah, and Vortex Boys, people who like this terrible skill because Creeping Frost is just better, you guys got a pretty massive buff as well. 1456 all the way up to 2315. Pretty massive. Now moving down to the burning skills that now deal more damage. These are going to be skills that just generically deal burning damage, not particularly ignites. Some notable things is you see that Righteous Fire is going from 1541 up to 2447. That's pretty massive. Vol Righteous Fire is dealing 120% of Sacrifice Energy Shield and Life as fire damage up to 158%. This is a pretty massive buff to Vol Righteous Fire if you're using it for damage. And then also we're getting some pretty massive buffs to things like Fire Trap. Fire Trap might actually be worthwhile to level with now, potentially, because it got a pretty massive buff here. This is a really big buff, so hopefully this might be something that you can level with again. Maybe Pox is happy, Fire Trap is good again. Flame Wall is also getting a little bit of a buff here. This isn't a massive buff, but it is a pretty decent sized buff. Flame Wall might be okay to level with as well now. It might be pretty good early on. And that's pretty much it for what I personally think is worthwhile to look into here. Many of the skills that had Ignite multiplier have had their multiplier removed. Like I said before, Fireball, Discharge, things like Armageddon Brand, Burning Arrow. These were things that were very good for Ignite because they had those multipliers. The skill has been balanced to compensate for this if necessary. Certain skills have been rebalanced due to the change to base Ignite damage, taking into account whether they're able to take full advantage of Elemental Overload now. Note that examples below do not include the effect of Elemental Overload or Elemental Equilibrium, hence why the Ignite value is much higher for many of the skills. So for example, like I said here, Fireball no longer has more damage with Ignite. It has a base chance to Ignite, and on average, it says Ignite with the skill is now 33% higher. So keep in mind here, this is 33% higher, and it's not taking into account the change with Elemental Overload. If the ability can use Elemental Overload, it should still get some buff as well. We haven't been told, as you'll see later on, what the specific numbers of Elemental Overload is, if it's being changed or if the number's staying the same. Discharge is also going to get a 60.7% higher damage with Ignite. Flame Blast is getting 75% higher damage with Ignite at level 10. Incinerate, which not very many people were using, I mean, maybe it'll be good. It's getting a 250% more Ignite damage instead of 500. I'm not sure how to feel about this. It says it's 45.8% higher. Said it received a harsher damage loss because it still works very well with Elemental Overload. There's some more things in here like Fire Burst, Hex Blast. If you're interested in some of these specific ones, Penance Brand is listed here. Divine Ire, Explosive Concoction. This is a pretty massive buff. Ignite with this skill is now 155% higher if you had plus 50% of fire damage over time multiplier. I don't know why they specified on this one. Kind of confusing, but I guess we'll figure that out. Armageddon Brand is apparently going to be working well with the Elemental Overload, however it's going to be working now. They added Shattering Steel in here for some reason, because apparently Shattering Steel did more damage with hits for, you know, ailments and stuff like that. I guess rest in peace to poison or bleed-based versions of this, I guess. Explosive Arrow is also going to do a little bit more damage with 20 arrows on the target. Sentinels of Purity have 40% less life because of base Ignite damage changes. Ignite with the skill is now 50% higher when using the Death Wish skill. Why are they summoned with 40% less life now? Why is that mentioned here? I'm not sure. Frost Bomb is in this Ignite section here because of base Ignite damage. Ignite with the skill is now 74% higher. People were igniting with Frostbomb? Question mark? Now, they talk a little bit about Elemental Overload here. It says now gives more hit and ailment elemental damage to skills if they crit in the last 8 seconds. So what this means is it's giving hit and ailment elemental damage skills. So of note, cold damage over time is not an ailment. However, Ignite is, so if an ability is going to be working with Ignite, Elemental Overload is probably good, or if it's going to be hitting, Elemental Overload is probably good. But for abilities that are non-ailment damage over time, elemental damage, it doesn't look like Elemental Overload is going to function any longer. On top of that, it also says that you can't use a second rapidly hitting skill because it's particular to the skill. It says gives more hit and ailment damage to skills if they crit in the last 8 seconds. So you're not going to be able to use just a random other skill to proc Elemental Overload all the time. It's going to have to be the skill that actually is doing the damage. Now, Elemental Equilibrium got hit a lot harder. Elemental Equilibrium is going to be applying exposure now. It's not going to be applying like negative resistance. This is exposure, meaning it's not going to stack with the other forms of exposure that are in the game. This is a pretty massive nerf. I don't exactly know how this is going to work out or what it's going to be useful for. Probably as just an easier way to obtain exposure in certain cases. They also said that they've moved it down to the bottom right side of the tree, so it's going to be over closer to Ranger now for abilities like Wild Strike and stuff like that that have harder times getting exposure. But Raider had exposure. 25% is a little bit more than what Raider gave, I think. I'm not 100% positive on that. Interesting change here with Elemental Equilibrium, just moving it off to the other side of the tree. Now builds don't have to like go all the way down for it if they don't want to. If they're up towards the top, they don't have to creep down into the middle. But if you're going low life most of the time, you're around there anyways. But one of the bigger changes for damage over time is how much support they're getting on gear. This is honestly a pretty large change for builds that are going to actually invest into damage over time. There's a bunch of new modifiers that give extra damage over time. Some ones that are useful are mainly going to be these jewels. Things like jewels can now roll a faster damage of ailments prefix modifier with 4 to 6. Faster ailment damage is very, very powerful for things like Ignite. There's also a new global damage over time multiplier modifier that can roll on jewels with 4 to 6. And the previous Fire, Cold, Physical, and Chaos ones are being buffed to 6 to 8 instead of 3 to 4. This will make up for some of those cluster jewel like nerfs that happened previously, so now normal jewels will be doing even more damage for damage over time. They're also buffing a bunch of other areas, like damage over time multipliers on Influence Gloves can go up to 16 to 20 now, and then also like faster Ignite, Poison, and Bleed modifiers on boots can roll a little bit higher. There's a lot of good and powerful buffs that they're doing to damage over time for elements. The next one here is interesting. Burning Arrow is too complex for a level 1 skill. I didn't feel like it was that complex, but I kind of get what you mean because it had the secondary burning effect as well as trying to scale Ignite and having to do attack damage and all that kind of stuff. So their goal is redesign the skill without a secondary stacking burning effect, but with a high added fire damage against ignited enemies. So no longer has a stacking burning effect. Now deals 150% base damage at level 1, which is unchanged, up to 214% base base damage instead of 184. And now also adds 3 to 4 fire damage to attacks at level 1, up to 201 to 302 fire damage at level 20. So what this means is that most likely the way that you're going to play Burning Arrow for bosses, you will probably use that Delirium helmet with Snipe is potentially the way that you're going to go about this, because it's just going to matter the one big giant Burning Arrow that hits, because you're not going to have to stack attack speed anymore. You don't need to stack that secondary debuff. If you want to play endgame Burning Arrow, it might be pretty good now. We'll have to see how that goes. We'll have to see how it interacts with Snipe and things like that. I'm not 100% certain. That's just an idea that some people were talking about on my Discord, which is linked down in the description. You should go join it, by the way. So the last thing to talk about Ignite is that Ignite builds don't have a way to focus their damage on bosses. This is definitely a big issue. It is one of the main reasons why Burning Arrow was actually a good build for single target, because you could stack up that burning effect. So it forces the balance to be the same for clear speed damage and for boss damage. The solution is to change Flame Surge and then introduce a new attack-based mechanic to be able to deal much more burning damage to a targeted enemy. What they say is Flame Surge is getting a new burning ground mechanic that deals damage based on ignites on the target, and we're investigating a similar mechanic for attacks. This could be pretty huge for Ignite builds, because one of the major obstacles to overcome for Ignite builds was getting that single target damage. It just really wasn't that good. Because you could proliferate Ignite so well and it could go so far out into, you know, like multiple screens at the same time, it was really hard to make them actually do damage on single target. That's why Burning Arrow was good. So if Flame Surge is made to be a way for burning builds or Ignite-based builds to do extra single target damage, that's going to be pretty powerful. And that is going to be it for the video. Pretty good changes. I like pretty much all of these. They seem really solid. We're going to have to see if overall this is a buff, like how big of a buff it is to like cold damage and Ignite, because they said that they're making it just so that they don't need to, you know, survive off of Elemental Equilibrium and Elemental Overload. Hopefully when the numbers all come in, maybe when these get into Path of Building, it is an overall significant damage buff for these builds, because honestly, Cold Dot is in a really rough place right now. It's not doing a lot of damage. There's not much reason to go Cold Dot right now compared to anything else. So I'm pretty excited about these. I'm really hopeful that these changes are exactly what they say. Aura is getting more powerful, Curse is getting more powerful for people who aren't stacking both of those things, and Elemental Damage over time getting a massive utility and potentially damage buff. So remember, boys, if you're enjoying the content, make sure that you like this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel for more content similar to this, and stay safe out there in raid class. And I'll see you guys in the next video.